Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Paul Stevens, Associate Fellow at Chatham House and Emeritus Professor at the University of Dundee and a Distinguished Fellow at the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan. I think all those titles tell you that Professor Paul Stevens has had a long and distinguished career and is recognized globally as one of the leading voices in international energy industry. Paul, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Where do you start in these times? But ultimately, Paul, they say that history doesn't repeat itself; it rhymes. What does this moment, energy markets, oil markets trading well above $110 a barrel, war in Ukraine? How does this moment in history compare to anything previously, or where are the echoes?
Well, we've had these sorts of oil price shocks before, most notably in the 1970s, but the world was different then. I think what is different this time round is that before we had the war in Ukraine, we had COVID. We had the COVID pandemic, and it's worth reminding people that in April 2020. The price of WTI was minus $30 a barrel. In other words, you had to pay people to take it away. And this has had all sorts of interesting and will continue to have interesting consequences. So the situation is slightly different. As to where we go in the future, that depends entirely, I think, on what happens in Ukraine. And of course, we can't know that, although my best guess is that it's likely to be a long drawn out process, but that as more evidence emerges of Russian war crimes, the pressures are going to be ever greater to try and block Russian energy exports, which will have significant implications for the future of energy markets.
If we take that point, I mean, in some ways, regardless of what happens from here, the genie is out of the bottle. The trust is broken. The structural shift in the paradigm has happened, a bit like in the 1970s when OPEC created the embargo of oil on the Western countries supporting Israel in the 73 war. Once there was 1 day of an embargo, it didn't matter if there was 100 days. The line had been crossed. Yeah. And on this context, 50 years later, has the line been crossed here vis-a-vis a total restructuring of global energy flows? Europe has made a decision to move away from Russia. If it takes 5 or 10 years, the road is built.
Yeah, I think you're right on this. I mean, the important point to note here, I think, is that because of what's happened in Ukraine, energy security of supply is back top of the agenda, whereas it had been very much pushed off the agenda, in large part as a result of concern about the energy crisis, the climate crisis, and all the rest of it. Security of supply now is back front and center, and this will have enormous implications going forward, particularly on energy policy. And so the energy policy, I think, is going to be aimed very much at securing energy supplies, and this is particularly true in Europe. In some ways, the rest of the world can manage, particularly when it comes to oil. There are alternative sources of oil available, although it will take some time perhaps for them to come online. The big problem, I think, is with gas, particularly in Europe. And the reason for this is very simple. Oil you can get from anywhere and just get a tanker to come in and deliver the oil products, but gas you can't. You've got LNG, of course, but the LNG capacity is somewhat limited. And the other point worth mentioning, I think, for gas, and this is not generally understood, is you can't turn gas on and off. If you've got a residential area dependent upon gas, you can't turn it off and then turn it back on, because you need a gas engineer at every burner tip to make sure the gas has been turned off. And of course, if you're putting gas into a power station or a manufacturing plant, that's easy enough. You can afford to have a gas engineer there. But in residential areas, it's not. And that's a big deal. That's going to be a big problem.
Well, all of those pieces of the puzzle, if you like, one, obviously the absence of adequate storage, as you say, in oil, it's more fungible. It's already moving around the world in ships every day, whether you buy here or there. Of course, there's pipeline oil, which is quite efficient in its distribution. But from a gas point of view, there's no which way to cut the cake on this. Europe and perhaps beyond, but certainly Europe, will have to pay more for its energy going forward. That now is a built-in given, is it? I mean, we've seen big swings in gas prices over the last 10 years, but on the average, are we going to see a future in which these, not maybe these highs, but elevated energy prices that Europe is used to will become permanent?
I think it'll become permanent for a while. But you have to remember there is a very viable alternative to gas, namely renewables. And indeed, renewables are now cheaper than gas, particularly at these current gas prices. And so what this is likely to lead to is a dramatic increase in the use of renewables. In other words, the energy transition that we were in the middle of, moving away from hydrocarbon molecules to electrons, is going to speed up as a result of this. Now, of course, it's not going to happen overnight because these things take time, but certainly all the pressures are going to be on for energy policy, particularly in Europe, to move towards renewables.
In terms of sanctioning or embargoing Russian oil and gas, so far the US and Canada have done so, but obviously they are recipients of very little amounts and have multiple alternatives. Europe has not, and the rest of the world has not. But yet there are all these other sanctions put in place, particularly on the finances and on insurance and shipping, insurance cover and so on, structural impediments, if you like. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the impact these sanctions will have. Generally, at the moment, it doesn't look like much. Gas is flowing as normal. Oil is getting to the market. The ruble is back to where it was pre-Ukraine invasion. Are these sanctions having any impact? Where do you think they will go?
It's an important question, and there's been a long debate about the effectiveness of economic sanctions as to whether they work or not. And if you look at history, in most cases, they tend not to work. There have been some notable exceptions. The obvious exception was apartheid South Africa, although one has to say there that the sanctions that hit South Africa were not against access to oil. It was to do with sport. Unfortunately, the Russians don't play cricket and they don't play rugby, because otherwise that might have made things a lot easier. But the outcome of ordinary sanctions is not particularly great. And as you say, to some extent, the ruble has recovered, but it's worth pointing out that they are having a very negative effect on the Russian economy. I mean, you have inflation. The Russians are about to default on their debt, which will be a big deal. And so sanctions do have some sort of an impact. And I think they have this time as well. I think the Russian war aims have now switched away from a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, although that's in part as a result of the Ukraine beating the Russians on the ground, as it were. But it's difficult to see that sanctions will have a significant impact to stop the war.
Yeah, it looks like the war could grind into a sort of a Bosnian setup where nobody really wins, but ultimately it grinds and is a disruptor for, unfortunately, in the case of Bosnia, it was many years. I mean, there is a question of the more weaponry, the more capability one gives the Ukrainians to sort of repel the Russians, the longer you sort of drag this out without any real chance that the Ukrainians can ever have in winning.
Yes, I mean, I think it's very unlikely to envisage a situation where the Ukrainians can beat the Russians militarily. The Russians can lose militarily, and in fact have been losing militarily big time. And this, of course, may cause some sort of unrest back home which may put pressure on Putin, although it's very doubtful because I don't think anybody who opposes Putin gets a chance to talk to him about this. But yeah, I foresee a long drawn out process.
In terms of the sanctions, and clearly they are some adopted by some, rejected by others. When you take the oil piece and the energy side, it's kind of a strange situation where the Americans and to a certain less extent Europe, but certainly the US are kind of barking at India and others for continuing to import discounted Russian oil, but not making it compulsory for others. That inconsistency seems to be really irritating the Indians. But I'm just wondering, where do you think the geopolitics of this sort of goes vis-a-vis those who take the soup and those who don't, as we used to say in Ireland?
Yes, it's a good question. It depends on the extent to which the Americans can use their diplomatic levers to persuade countries like India and China not to take Russian energy. And I suspect that the levers are simply not there, particularly because Russia will offer significant discounted prices to make it attractive for them to do so. However, having said that, it will impede Russian energy exports, and this in turn will impede the revenue flows into Russia, not in a disastrous way, but it'll sort of chip away at it over time.
If you look at that sort of some of the narratives that were in play before the Ukraine war, the Russian war on Ukraine, is probably the more appropriate way to describe it, but that there was a global crevice emerging between China and the US, less to extent between China and Europe. Now this crevice seems to be growing with this kind of idea of a bloc emerging, this Russian-China bloc versus Europe-America bloc. Your thoughts on that? Where do you think that goes?
Yeah, I mean, I think one has to be careful here. China is far too smart to come out openly supporting what Russia is doing. They will make noises, but not take any particular action against them. The danger is, of course, that you're moving to a situation of a renewal of the Cold War, initially between Russia and the United States, but with also China lurking on the sidelines. Now, the problem with the Cold War that people forget is that it was cold because most of the fighting was done by proxies. And so the US and the Russians each had their own client states, particularly in the Middle East. And this is an area that I'm concerned about, is that a revival of the Cold War will mean a sort of greater divisions and therefore instability in the Middle East as the sort of clients of the Americans and clients of the Russians come head to head in the region. And
looking at that, I mean, the flip side of that coin might be, again, coming back to the pre-Ukraine conflict, this sort of hot war before this hot war in the Ukraine, that the Middle East was already sort of realigning itself vis-a-vis the Iran nuclear talks and vis-a-vis the perception / reality that the US was slowly withdrawing from the region. And we're finding these new alliances that, Israel, UAE being the most pronounced one, and finding stability perhaps in the absence of a big brother or a school teacher at the front of the class.
Yeah, I mean, there is that danger, and the Americans clearly have been sort of trying to extract themselves from the Middle East, but it's extremely unlikely that they're going to be able to do that. And if you look at the big hitters in the Middle East, you're looking at Saudi Arabia and Iran. And Saudi Arabia, whatever else may occur, will continue to depend upon the US for military protection against the Iranians. I don't think there's any doubt about that. They're certainly not capable of defending themselves.
But yet they do seem to be in a period where they're quite willing to poke their finger in the eye of Washington.
Absolutely, and not surprising given the sort of comments that Joe Biden made during the elections and after the elections. And people have long memories and are a lot likely to be happy about that. But when push comes to shove, the Saudis simply cannot stand on their own against the Iranians, particularly with the Russians involved as well. And so, therefore, we'll have to some extent, although they won't like it, toe the line for the Americans.
I mean, taking that bigger narrative of the idea, again, this is a pre-COVID and a pre-Ukraine thing. China's arrival in the Middle East, becoming a big commercial trade partner. Obviously, China, the biggest customer of Saudi oil and most energy coming out of the Gulf, but also an investor in the region, becoming a big actor in the upstream operations in the region, but yet offers zero contribution to the security of the high seas.
Yeah, I mean, this is what you say is perfectly true. But nonetheless, Saudi Arabia remains crucially important simply because it's such a large exporter of oil and has the potential to increase capacity to export oil.
In terms of toe the line, as you reference it, the idea, where does OPEC Plus fit in this post-Ukraine outlook of the world? I mean, this is an agreement which by design comes to its expiry date in September. Yeah. We've had Putin on the phone this week with at least published with Saudi ruler and with the Algeria. Where do you think the OPEC Plus pact go after Ukraine and after the deal expires in September?
That's a very good question. I'll just make a couple of points here. OPEC, and indeed OPEC Plus, only become really relevant if the oil price is falling and the oil price is very low. And the reason for this is simple. If the oil price is low, the oil producers are struggling from a revenue point of view, and they need to try and gain some control over the market. Hence, they get together, they agree, they cheat and they fiddle around, but nonetheless, it has some impact on prices. But with prices at these sorts of levels, and it's difficult to see, depending on what happens in the Ukraine, the price going much below current levels for the foreseeable future, then OPEC Plus effectively becomes irrelevant. And again, we come back to this issue of who is going to support who. It's very unlikely that the Saudis are going to come out with full support of Russia, simply because they can have disagreements with Washington, but their whole being depends upon remaining on good terms with Washington. And so in those circumstances, I think it's inconceivable that you're going to see a continuation of OPEC Plus beyond rhetoric and meaningless statements. I mean, let's face it, if you look at the history of OPEC Plus, Russia cheated time and time again on it and ignored the agreements and just carried on producing whatever it wanted to produce. I don't see there's much future for OPEC Plus, but then, as I say, while the oil price remains high, there's no need for it. It only becomes an issue, and we're talking now here much medium and longer term, that prices will start to come down. There's no doubt about this.
Well, let's talk finish up in that space, that the oil price, that this could be the last peak oil demand or peak oil price period, the last big windfall. And the big question mark I would have there as a final question is, where is China going? We've had some commentators, very well respected Chinese oil industry professionals, calling already peak oil demand in China, given that this 30-year period of constructing roads and bridges and endless apartment blocks for as far as the eye can see, the cement era of China is over, and so oil demand might peak.
I think it already has peaked in many parts. Well, certainly if you look at the OECD, it's peaked, quite possibly in China as well. And it's sort of, if you like, then downhill from here on in, which reinforces my idea that if we have repeat demand, then the only way for prices to go, absent more geopolitical upheavals, of course, that's always a necessary qualification, then the only way for prices to go is down. Now, of course, that can become a vicious circle, because if the oil price goes down, a lot of oil producing countries will be in serious trouble, will be facing domestic upheavals, and that could lead to a sort of another mini price shock. But there's no question, I think we're in for a rather rough ride on this.
And more immediately, just on the China piece, there's been big questions in recent days whether China's COVID lockdown and its current sort of demand weakness will follow right through the course of this year and be enough to compensate for possible disruption out of Russia. Your thoughts on that paradigm?
Yeah, it's a difficult one because it depends upon what the Chinese policy is going to be when it comes to COVID. Now, they began by trying to say, right, we're going to have zero COVID, hence the lockdown in Shanghai, etc. But in the absence of a massive vaccination program, that's not going to be very realistic. So at some point in the proceedings, China is probably going to have to follow what much of Europe has had to do, which is basically say, okay, we just have to live with COVID. We roll out the vaccination program and just get on with it and treat COVID like seasonal flu, for example. I think that's quite likely to happen. But then, as I say, I think that we probably have getting close to peak oil. And if I'm right about the energy transition speeding up, and a greater use of renewables, this gives an option. And given that security of energy supply is back on the table, it's very likely that we're going to see a boost for renewables from government policies encouraging, because of course the beauty of renewables is that they are domestically produced.
Well, it's certainly going to be the big outcome to see what happens, and whether you get both, perhaps accelerated commitment to spend on new energy, but at the same token, a renewed last blast on hydrocarbons. Professor Paul Stevens, Associate Fellow at Chatham House, thank you so much for being on this week's Halftime Talk.
It's been a pleasure. It's been extremely interesting.
Thank you.